원사있는 고양이 제인이에요. 오늘은 해리포터 3권 Chapter 10 The Marauder's Map. 어제 읽던 거 마저 읽어보도록 할게요. 냐옹! What with the promise of anti-dementor lessons from Lupin, Phil thought they'd never have to Harry's nervous stamp again, and the fact that Ravenclaw threatened Hufflepuff in their Quidditch match into Never on River, Harry's mood took a definite upturn. Gryffindor were not out of the warning after all, for though they could not lose another match. Wood became repossessed of his manic energy, had worked his tin as hard as ever at the chilly haze of rain. It persisted into December. Harry saw no hint of a Dementor within the ground. Dumbledore's anger seemed to be keeping them as stations at the entrances. 2 weeks before the end of term, the sky lightened suddenly into a dazzling opaline light, and the muddy grounds were revealed one morning covered in glittering frost. Inside the castle, there was a buzz of Christmas in the air. Professor Flitwick, the charms teacher, had already decorated his classroom with the shimmering lights, turned out to be real, fluttering fairies. The students were all happily discussing their plans to holidays. Both Ron and Hermione had decided to remain at Hogwarts, and there Ron said because he couldn't stand 2 weeks with Percy, and Hermione insisted she needed to use the library. Harry wasn't fooled. They were doing it to keep him company, and he was very grateful. To everyone's delight, except Harry's, there was to be another Hogsmeade trip in the very last weekend of term. "We could do all of our Christmas shopping there," said Hermione. "Mom and Dad will really love their 2,000 streamers from Honeydukes." Resigned to the fact that he would be the only third year staying behind again, Harry borrowed a copy of Witch Broomstick with Rude and decided to spend the day reading up on the different makes. He had been riding one of the stroll rooms at team practice, an ancient shooting star, and because very slow and jerky, he definitely needed a new broom of his own. The Saturday morning of the Hogsmeade trip, Harry bid goodbye and Ron and Hermione, who were wrapped in cloaks and scarves, then turned up the marble staircase alone, headed back to the Gryffindor Tower. Snow had started to fall outside the windows, and the castle was very still and quiet. "Psst, Harry!" He turned halfway along the third corridor to see Fred and George peering out at him from behind the statue of a humpback, one-eyed witch. "What are you doing?" said Harry curiously. "How come you're not to Hogsmeade?" "We've come to give you a bit of festive cheer before we go," said Fred with a mysterious wink. "Come in here." He nodded towards an empty classroom to the left of one-eyed statue. Harry followed Fred and George inside. George closed the door quietly and then turned, beaming to look at Harry. "Early Christmas present for Harry." Fred threw something inside his cloak with a flourish and laid it on the front of the desk. It was a large, square, very worn piece of parchment, with nothing written on it. Harry, suspecting one of Fred and George's joke, stared at it. "What's that supposed to be?" "This, Harry, is the secret of our success," said George, patting the parchment fondly. "It's a wrench beaming to you," said Fred. "I really decided last night your needs greater than ours. Anyway, we know it by heart, and George, so we bequeath it to you. We never need it anymore." "And what do I do with a bit of parchment?" said Harry. "A bit of old parchment," said Fred, closing his eyes with a grimace as though Harry mortally offended him. "Explain, George." "Well, when we were in our first year, Harry, young, carefree, and innocent," Harry snorted. He doubted whether Fred and George had ever been innocent. Well, more innocent than we are now, we got into the startup border with Filch. We met a little dumbbell in the corridor and upsetting to some reason. So he hauled us to be obsessed and started threatening us with the usual detention, disembowelment, and we counted the drawer in one of the filing cabinets marked Contest Reading and Highly Dangerous. Don't tell me, said Harry, starting to grin. Well, what should you have done, said Fred. George caused a diversion by dropping the dumb bomb. I whipped the drawer open and grabbed this. Instead of throwing this out, said George. We don't reckon Filch ever found out how to work it. He probably suspected what it was, though, or he would have confiscated it. And you know how to work it. Oh, yes, said Fred, smirking. This little beauty stirred up more than teachers in this school. You're winding me up, said Harry, looking at the ragged old bit of parchment. Oh, Ari, said George. I sucked at this one, touched the parchment lightly, and said, I solemnly swear that I am up to no good. And at once thin ink lines began to spread like a spider's web from the point that George's wand had touched. They joined each other, crisscrossed, they fanned into every corner of the parchment. Then words began to blossom across the top, great curly green words that proclaimed Messrs. Mooney, Wormtail, Petfoot, and Prongs, purveyors of aids to magical mischief makers, and are proud to present the Marauder's map. It was a map showing every detail of the Hogwarts castle and grounds. But the truly remarkable thing was the tiny ink dots moving around it, each labeled with a name in ministerial writing. Astounded, Harry bent over it. A label dot in the top left corner showed that Professor Dumbledore was pacing his study. The caretaker's cat, Mrs. Norris, was prowling the second floor, and Peeves the poltergeist, the furniture bouncing around the trophy room. And Harry's eyes traveled up and down the familiar corridors. He noticed something else. This map showed a set of passages he had never entered, and many of them seemed to lead right into Hogsmeade, said Fred, tracing one of them with his finger. There are 7 in all. Well, Filch knows about these 4, she pointed it out, but we're sure we're the only ones who know about these. Don't bother with the one behind the mirror on the 4th floor. We used it until this wiggle and caved in to completely blocked. And we don't reckon anyone's ever used this one, because the whooping willows planted right over the entrance. But this one here, this one's led right into the cellar of Honeydukes. We used it all the times, and you might have noticed the entrance is right outside this room, through that one-eye, one-crone's hub. Mooney, Wormtail, Petfoot, and Prongs, sighed, patting the hair of the map. We owe them so much. Noblemen, working tirelessly of an unusual nation of roll bakers, said Fred sullenly. Right, said George briskly. Don't forget to wipe it after you use it, or anyone can read it, said warningly. Tap it again and say, Mischief managed, and it'll go rank. So, young Harry, said Fred in an uncanny impersonation of Percy, mind you behave yourself. See you in Honeydukes, said George, winking. They left the room, both smirking in a satisfied sort of way. Harry stood there, gazing at the miraculous map. He watched the tiny ink Mrs. Norris turn left and paused to sniff at something from the floor. If Filch really didn't know, he wouldn't have to pass the Dementors at all. But even as he stood there, flooded with excitement, something Harry had once heard Mr. Weasley say came floating out of his memory. Never trust anything. Think for yourself if you can't see where it keeps his brain. This map was one of the dangerous magical objects Mr. Weasley had been warning against. Aids for magical mischief made it. But then Harry reasoned he only wanted to use it to get into Hogsmeade. It wasn't as though it was to steal anything or attack anyone. And Fred and George had been using it for years without anything horrible happening. Harry traced its crooked presses to Honeydukes with his finger. Then, quite suddenly, as though following orders, he rolled up the map, stuffed it inside his robes, and hurried to the door of the classroom. He opened it a couple of inches. There was no one outside. Very carefully, he aimed out of the room and slipped behind the statue of the one-eyed witch. What did he have to do? This astonishment that a new ink figure had appeared on it, labeled Harry Potter. This figure was standing exactly where they viewed Harry standing, about halfway down the third-floor corridor. Harry watched happily, and the little ink sub appeared to be tapping the witch with his minute wand. Vic took out his real wand and tapped the statue. Nothing happened. He looked back at the map. The tiniest big bubble had appeared next to his figure, where the inside said Descendium. Descendium, Harry whispered, tapping the stone witch again. At once, the statue's hump opened wide enough to admit a very thin person. Harry glanced quickly up and down the corridor and then tucked the mat away again, hoisted himself onto the hole and first pressed himself forward. He slid a considerable way down what felt like a stone slide, then landed on cold, damp earth. He stood up, looking around. It was pitch dark. He held up his wand, muttered, Lumos, and saw that he was in a very narrow, low, earthy passageway. He raised the map, tapped it with the tip of his wand, and muttered, Mischief managed. The map went blank at once. He folded it carefully, tucked it inside his robe, and, half beating fast, both excited and apprehensive, he set off. 재미있게 들으셨다면 구독과 좋아요 꾹꾹 눌러주시고 다음 영상에서 만나요. 안녕!